Welcome to another episode of the Living Proof podcast. Today we have Tom Whipple, who is science editor at The Times. With me on the mic we have Maha Kaori. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you for having me.
It's a real pleasure to have you here. So, Tom, you actually read maths here at Cambridge as an undergraduate, and then you went on into journalism. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what took you along that path, what made you decide to go into journalism.
Yes, so I did my undergraduate at Churchill College here, and I was here from 2000 until 2004, and I loved maths. I still love maths. I don't think any of my supervisors would claim that I was ever destined to set the world of maths alight, but I very much enjoyed it. But whilst I was here, I also did student journalism, kind of as a way out would be putting it too strongly, but as a way of using a different part of my brain, because I mean the maths was phenomenally intense, and it was nice to do something just totally different. And I also very much enjoyed the student journalism, and I loved the aspect of it that was speaking to interesting people and trying to tell the story of their lives. I mean, a variety of interesting people I interviewed. Ian Paisley, I also interviewed Steve Goff, the Naked Rambler, and went naked rambling with him on the south coast because he was big news at the time. My mum wasn't particularly happy when she learned I was going to stay in his caravan with him overnight. But it was great fun. And when I left, I was still very much thinking about using my maths, doing. I did a computing after doing maths here, and I thought, well, maybe I'd become a programmer or something. But then I gave the journalism a go, not with a view to doing scientific journalism, just with a view to interviewing naked or clothed people, but kind of, one or the other or both. But I really enjoyed it, and I got a job at the Times, doing lots of different things, not doing scientific journalism, but eventually I was at the Times long enough that the other science person left, and as I said, I love maths, and I suppose I'm reasonably good at it, but in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, and I was very much the one-eyed man scientifically in the kingdom of humanities graduates, and so they offered me the job of science editor, and that's what I've been doing ever since.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you. And then, so you were involved in one of the study groups for the Newton Gateway and VChems. And I just wanted to ask, so in that we were talking about communicating maths. So what kind of skills have you learned in communicating maths and communicating science in general that you think you could maybe pass on to other mathematicians?
I would say I'll start with maths. I think maths is sort of the apotheosis of communicating science, because communicating science is hard, but maths is something where it's created its own complete language, and it exists, and then that's what's beautiful about maths is you can communicate with someone in China, communicate with someone in Iran using maths. It's, we have this formalized notation, we have this way of describing things, but the reason we've created this way of describing things and these equations is because words don't do it very well at all. And that's the problem with writing about maths, is that to a large extent you can't write about maths. It's not something that's amenable to words, or it wouldn't be maths. So I have to find a way around that, and that's true for all science. All science at its cutting edge, which is ultimately what I should be writing about, is by its fundamental nature inaccessible, or we would have accessed it 2,000 years ago. We wouldn't have required the full steamroller of the Enlightenment to get to where we are. But obviously you find ways to do that, and you talk about things that people do understand. Now, sometimes that can be an application. It's quite easy in biology. If I'm writing about a study on moth wings and how they can dampen sound, well, there's loads of maths behind that, but we all know what a moth wing is. We all know what sound is. And, we all know what someone proposing to make a wallpaper out of mothwing, not actual moth wings, that would be psychotic, but some sort of, simulacrum of moth wings means. And so you can talk about it there and you can get across what's going on. Things get harder the more abstract you get. A really good example is the Higgs boson. I think there were probably only a very small handful of people in the world who genuinely understand what was going on with the Higgs boson, and I think half of them are lying. And so we had to find a way to do that, and we had to find a way to describe it because it's very important. And you ended up with lots of analogies, and analogies are important up to the point where they illuminate. And I think we almost reached the point of the Higgs boson where the analogies became more and more complex, such that people were just gripping on to what the analogy meant, and then just almost lost sight of what the Higgs boson was at the bottom of this. But, you've got these wonderful ones about Margaret Thatcher walking through a room and gaining attendees trying to badger her with questions, and that's a bit like the Higgs boson creating mass around it in the Higgs field. And that was great, and that was very hard, but that was very satisfying as a journalist. And then you get to maths, which I suppose ostensibly is the discipline I should be most comfortable with writing about, but it's not, because I think as everyone listening to this knows, maths is really hard, and to understand the field, you have to have sort of dedicated your life to it. And so then you're looking for something different, and sometimes in maths it's enough to understand the problem. I think you accept, and readers accept, that we're not going to be able to understand the proof. I have 600 words in a news story. If I'm lucky, I'll get a magazine story, and then I've got 3,000. And you're not going to explain a modern proof in that length. But if you can explain the problem, that in itself is great. If it's something to do with how oranges are stacked, or if you get lucky and it's Pythagoras extended to higher dimensions, then suddenly people have got something that they can grip onto. And with the case of Fermat's last theorem, you've also got this wonderful story about Fermat's marginalia, which, he almost certainly hadn't proved it, but it's a wonderful, wonderful story. And then you've got a tale that you can tell, and you can give people a glimpse of the maths, and that's all you can ever hope for. And I mean, I slightly felt that was all I could ever really hope for with my undergraduate degree. I felt that the best that it gave me was it kind of elevated me to this point where I could just peek my head onto the plateau of maths and get this idea of the complexity going on there, and more in a non-pompous way, maybe, hopefully, give me an idea of my own ignorance and a fuller sense of that. And I think if you can do that, I think that's a wonderful thing. And we've got this idea, sometimes mathematicians have this idea that, a slightly chippy idea, that people, you'll hear it said in so many ways, in so many different forms, people are proud to say that they're enumerate. People are, that no one would admit that they haven't listened to Shakespeare or watched Shakespeare, but they would admit they're not good at maths. And that is true to an extent, but there's also a very large number of people who really, really have affection for it. If you look at the most popular puzzles in the newspaper, it's all of these, even if they're not obviously maths like Sudoku, actually they're pretty much all maths. And these are people who really do want to understand to whatever degree that they can. And so we tell these stories and we try to find a way. The biggest story I've ever done, the longest story I've ever done, ostensibly about maths, was about someone from, probably sitting not terribly far from us here, Kausha Burka, who'd won the Fields Medal and had got this amazing story about escaping from Kurdistan and about a life that I think we'd agree is improbable to then end up with the Fields Medal. And I remember I wrote this story, and I wrote a story about how he came to Britain, and it gave a sort of soupçon of a hint of the maths as well. And I remember reading one of the comments from one of the readers, and one of the readers said, it's nice to finally have an in-depth story, done properly about maths. Why can't the Times do this more often? And then there was a reply from another reader saying, this isn't a story about maths at all. It's a story about a person. If it was about maths, you wouldn't have read it. Which is, I think there's probably there's truth in both those answers. And maybe the last thing I'd say is that I remember sitting on my first day as an undergraduate here, and we had a talk from our director of studies, welcoming us, giving us the pep talk, and then saying, and I think half he was sort of speaking to himself in this, he was saying, you might think throughout this, what's the point of this? I look around this room, and of the 23 at Churchill, maybe 3 are going to go into academia. Let's be honest, the rest of you are going to get absolutely loaded in banking or whatever. What's the point in doing this? And you won't ever need to integrate in n-dimensional space or do complex analysis or whatever. And then he gave the only answer you can. The stock answer is it teaches you to think in a particular way. It gives you this familiarity and deftness with numbers and with concepts that will stay with you for your life. And I always felt that was perhaps a little bit self-serving maybe, or a little bit of over-justification. But I think I've really seen in the pandemic what mathematicians can do. And not in their, standing at blackboards doing things way beyond my understanding sense, but just in the easy familiarity with which they can deal with numbers, trends, data sets, which is all, a pandemic is just, a virus is trouble because it spreads, and when it spreads, it's numbers. We're just talking about numbers. And you've really seen the difference between, and in a minor way myself, I've been suddenly, possibly, truly for the first time, I've been really grateful for my maths degree, because you find there are things going on in the numbers that you sort of, that seem intuitive, and it suddenly seems strange that they're not intuitive to other people, and then you realise that you have been trained a particular way, and I will never integrate in n-dimensional space again. I am entirely happy about that concept, but actually I think I have taken something away.
That's lovely, thank you. You answered this in a way, or touched on the answer to my next question through threads in your last answer. But maybe I'm going to ask it explicitly. So I know a lot of mathematicians can get quite frustrated that they have something really exciting that they feel that they want to tell, and they're not seeing enough representation of mathematics in the media, or if they say, I've got this great story, and then they get no response from the journalist they send it to, or they don't seeing it appearing there. So what advice do you have to tell people about the sorts of things that would excite your readership? So what can make a good story? What can mathematicians do to present a great story to you so that you could actually publish it and have it accepted by your editor?
It's interesting you added accepted by the editor, because of course you don't just have to get past me. I feel that probably I'm amongst, if not the most receptive in national journalism to maths because of my background. I then have to persuade an editor. The editor, and I'm not saying this is the best way at all to run a newspaper, but it is the way we're run, and it may be the best way to run it. The editor will take each morning he'll take my pitches from the day before, so I'll have pitched articles, and he or she will then pass those on to the main editor at a morning conference. So at morning conference, you've got the home news editor, sports editor, business editor, foreign editor, and they're all presenting stories, and they've got them all written down on the list, and they might be, 20 or 30 or something. So they have to go through, in this morning conference, 100 odd stories, each of which has to be written in a single sentence on a list. And during that time, they have to have sort of the yay or nay from the main editor. So if it can't be explained in a single sentence, it's very hard. Now, it's very hard to get it on. But let's say that you found a way to describe your maths in a single sentence. I've got to think that I can properly explain it in 600 words. 600 words is not many words at all. So I would sit down and think that the first test would be, if you're meeting a friend in a pub, would you bother telling them about this? And if you wouldn't, stop there, because it's not going to go any further with me. And then it would be, if you bother telling them about this, will it take all evening? Because I need to have got, certainly by the second paragraph, you need to have an understanding where it's going. None of this is impossible. Literally 2 days ago, I was writing about, it was actually a cancer story. It was early stage research, which I normally wouldn't cover for cancer because you have to be careful, because we can cure everything in mice. And it's just what happens afterwards that's a problem. But this particularly caught my eye because it was about switching the expression of a particular gene. And when you did, the pancreatic cancer tumour, the entire surface pattern of the tumour changed. It was like this tipping point for the shape of the cells. And what was going on was a Turing diffusion pattern. So Alan Turing, who I keep on being sort of slightly flabbergasted at everything he did that wasn't saving the world from the Nazis, he produced this paper on, it was sort of theoretical, and I'm sure most people are talking to know where I'm going with this, but about how do you get patterns appearing starting from a uniform state. And he came up with this idea of substances of all sorts diffusing through a medium, and if they're in this negative feedback cycle and one of them creates the other substance, which is where it gets really interesting, you can end up with these patterns appearing on the surface. And where am I going with this? Well, where I'm going with this is I can start this piece about treating cancer using mathematics, but I can start it by saying, the same process that gives a leopard its spots, a zebra its stripes, might also help cure pancreatic cancer. And then you've got then you can get into the maths, but you've done something, we all know what a leopard is, we all know what a zebra is, we all know what curing cancer means, and when in the second paragraph I can talk about Alan Turing, well that helps a lot.
Very good, very good. Actually, that reminds me of all the things that you touch on. I kind of keep thinking to myself, we had a very interesting programme back in 2012 that touched on, for instance, Alan Turing and his paper on pattern formation and things. So it's lovely hearing all of these things. You mentioned stacking oranges earlier on. We had Thomas Hales announcing his proof of Kepler's conjecture here in the Institute. So it's lovely hearing these stories that your world encounters actually touch upon I&I programs and cutting-edge mathematics research that's been presented here. So your advice to mathematicians is really make it so that there's a really good story there, and sometimes perhaps some people interest and...
Yes, I mean, look, having people is great. If we're stacking oranges, you can start talking about what Kepler said, and we all know who Kepler is, or loads of us know who Kepler is. And then you've got a narrative. Things like with Professor Burker, that was when I could get a big magazine piece. There was a really strong human story, and then I can start thinking about more things and more space. The answer, I often meet with people who say, what's a story? And the only answer is, and it's a deeply unsatisfying answer, but it is the truth, is you know it when you see it. And you know that if I can talk about leopards and zebras and stuff, or escaping Kurdistan, then I've got a story. The only other practical thing I'd say is this, and this really isn't something that I'm proud of, but it is a reflection of the realities of the industry. I currently have 1/3 unread emails in my inbox. I receive, I haven't actually worked it out. You can probably try to work out, I think probably sort of 500 odd a day or something. So I miss things. I try not to. I cannot possibly open every email because then that would be my job, would just be opening emails. So it's hard to get us. It shouldn't be, but this is the reality of how it is. So persist. If you think you've got something good, and I haven't replied, then quite possibly I'm really sorry I haven't seen it.
And do you think that kind of increased during the pandemic? Because obviously you're a science editor.
My workload, probably my number, I don't know if my number of emails increased. I'm certain my number of unread emails increased because I was writing, 3,000 words a day about a virus. I really didn't have time for much else. So yeah, I'm sure that happened to a degree.
And that's an interesting thing that I've become aware of so we've mentioned the pandemic, is maths used to be a very scary thing, that it wasn't really socially acceptable to talk about in the dinner party context, in the pub context, as we say before. And I think there was a shift in that. My perception is there was a shift in that in the pandemic. You would hear people in the supermarket having a conversation about the R number, which, probably wasn't talked about outside, university environments beforehand. And do you think that understanding and preparedness to talk about mathematical concepts is actually increased as a result of COVID?
I think certainly, with the slightly surreal I remember doing the differential equations of pandemics sort of in my second year or something here, and then I remember writing about the R number. It was my first piece about the pandemic. I was really proud of. I got so much wrong, but back in January 2020, I thought, right, well, this won't come to anything, but at least I can write about the R number. Won't that be a bit of interesting maths for the readers? And then, of course, we got the slightly surreal situation where herd immunity, this perfectly blameless epidemiological concept, became kind of a swear word. I think it certainly has increased our mathematical literacy. I remember, in fact, getting abused on Twitter by Toby Young, who accused me of not understanding Bayes' theorem, which was, I think it's wonderful when we've got to the rarefied level of discourse where that can be considered an insult. He was wrong, by the way. So, yes, I mean, and this shows, again, I think this shows how amenable the public is to it. I don't see a world, really, where people are afraid of touching maths to the extent that mathematicians sometimes feel. And I understand why mathematicians do feel removed from the general public because of the way that the subject has inevitably gone, because you are, I walk around this institute and I see blackboards that I have the faintest finger hold on what's going on those blackboards, and I studied maths here. So, of course, you can feel removed from the population, but I think every day we see examples of how much people want to understand the subject.
And for me, it's really refreshing and encouraging that your editors are listening to your pitches for stories like this, that you are getting them in, and even if it's the fact that you have to remove from the mathematics itself, at least if you're explaining the concepts behind it and keeping maths in conversation, I think that's a good step in the right direction towards making it not be this scary word that perhaps it was generations ago.
Yeah, and thinking about what you said actually about the pandemic improving mathematical literacy, I distinctly remember early March sitting down with my news editor and starting to explain herd immunity and being amazed. March 2020. And, as people know, it's, actually a marvellously satisfying mathematical concept. I mean, we now realise that immunologically the world's slightly different, but let's keep it in the equations for now. Herd immunity is very satisfying. And by the end of this conversation, not only had he not told me to go away, but a few other people were there. And then I wrote a big piece about how you calculate herd immunity and what it means. So yes, we're there, but it's, it's with maths, it's the balance between I have to be sure that the reader will read to the end. I can't use equations, and there has to be a way to engage people. But if you can do that, then people very much want it.
So the tip you're saying is don't have any technical language in there.
Absolutely not. I have a sort of view. So I imagine the reader as an intelligent person who knows nothing. And it's my job to explain to an intelligent person who knows nothing. And if I am using jargon or technical language in what I write, not only is that wrong for the reader, what it normally means is that I haven't understood it properly. I think if you find that you've got to explain using technical language, find another way. And if you're still doing it, then actually maybe you don't understand it properly either, because that's not how it works.
So you said that the pandemic was maybe one topic that got maybe people thinking about maths a bit. Are there other topics that you think, so for example, I could think of climate change as one. Is that something that would engage audiences, do you think, from a maths side?
It would. I mean, climate change has obviously got a lot of modelling, like the pandemic. And at the fundamental level, you're talking about thermodynamics and radiation equations. I think probably with climate change, it very rapidly becomes about politics and about lots of other things. It's more often that maths pops up when I'm talking about engineering or when we're talking about physics, or because as everyone knows, it's underpinning almost all the stuff that I would write about. And actually recently things like psychology, if I'm writing about the replication crisis and what a p-value is and what multiple comparisons corrections are, then things like statistics become very relevant.
And in fact, actually, just the breadth of the programs that we have running here at the Institute just say how maths just touches everything. So yes, we can really see it throughout everything and see how it can feature.
It is, but sometimes, it's like the plumbing. You don't get architects writing about the plumbing, but everyone notices if the toilet doesn't flush.
Yes.
And so that's the problem that maths can have, is it is the invisible servant of the sciences. Removing I don't think I can extend that analogy any further.
But actually, perhaps running with that is the story becomes interesting to you when it, for whatever reason, becomes visible. So if there is a crisis happening or something and we need to understand why that plumbing isn't working, to continue your analogy or something like that. So the story the maths part of the story isn't interesting to you until something isn't working and it comes to the fore, and then you need to know about the maths.
Yes, look, if something breaks because of an equation, if a satellite crashes because someone's used imperial rather than metric or something, then yeah, exactly, that becomes interesting. But it can also, I'm just thinking of other examples. I love metrology, the study of measurement, and recently we redefined the kilogram. It was defined in terms of a platinum iridium lump of metal in a Parisian vault. It was redefined in terms of Planck's constant. In fact, in two ways. One, in terms of Avogadro's constant. They built this crystal of silicon, which is the weirdest thing I've ever looked at. It's sort of the smoothest object in the world. The idea was to make a kilogram of silicon precisely, and to make it so precisely that you know exactly how many atoms are in it, and then you define it by the number of atoms, and then you define the Avogadro's constant by the kilogram, and then simultaneously do this with Planck's constant using a device called a Kibble balance, which is so precise you have to know the position of the moon when you're doing the calculation. And this very rapidly, to understand how you can define it in terms of Planck's constant, you very rapidly get into equations, and you very rapidly, with all metrology, get into maths. I mean, there's no way really to talk about an atomic clock without talking about these oscillations and the periods of microwaves and things. And so it does, I was going to say it comes up in unexpected places, but actually it comes up in very, very expected places, and you expect it almost everywhere.
That's amazing. I'm just aware now that at the rate of 500 emails a day, we've used up an awful lot of email entries into your inbox in this amount of time. We need to let you return to your editor, Tom. But thank you so much. This has been a really fascinating conversation, and I hope that as a result of it, it will help us as a community collectively pitch better stories to you so that you can get them past your editor.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.